I'm delighted to say we're kicking off the show this morning with Conservative peer Lord Moylan, a man who worked closely with Boris Johnson back in the days when he was Mayor of London, and a man who knows a thing or two about the Prime Minister. Lord Moylan, very good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you, Mike?
Very well indeed. Great to see you. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I mean, the first question really is, were you as dismayed and sort of besmirched as I was yesterday watching that briefing where literally we expected this big barnstorming performance for Boris Johnson to come out and tell us that everything was great and everything was moving forward, and instead he made one of the shortest speeches I think he's ever made and then handed it over to Chris Whitty and his next slide projection.
Yeah, well, he's being pulled in two directions, and I think that's why it's really important that people who do understand what normal life is keep making a noise and start pulling him back in the right direction, because I think that's really where his instincts lie. We've got to have a clear idea of what normal life is and aim to get back to it. And what the sage people, and I'm not complaining now about medical people and doctors, I'm complaining about the statisticians and the modelers who wouldn't know how to cure a boil on your bum. I mean, they're all mathematicians. I'm complaining about them, and what they're doing is they're stoking up fears for the future and saying we must be ready to handle those things in advance. And there's a degree in which we should be, but not to the extent of not getting back to normal. And you just imagine the huge database that has to exist of your medical details, all kept in digital form on your phone. I mean, these are huge intrusions into personal liberty that people in this country are going to find, many of them are going to find very, very strange. So what I'm saying is, if you've got to go, don't download the app. And if you're going to go to a venue where they demand that you show the app, tell them politely that you're taking your custom somewhere else.
Yes. And what do you say, Lord Moylan, to these people who are kind of against our point of view, if you like? And I'm not saying that you and I share every single point of view, but on this particular vaccine passport front, what do you say to these people who say, what's wrong with you? You know, we have passports to travel abroad. We have all sorts of digital footprints all over the place. We've got a DVLA driving license. We have insurance. You know, I try to convince them that this is not the same thing.
No, well, I don't think it is the same thing. And I don't mind having a vaccine passport for international travel. I'd rather it was a paper thing. I've had a paper document that says I've had my tetanus jab and my yellow fever. And many of us have that because we've traveled abroad. I mean, mine's out of date now because I've been abroad for so long.
Well, nobody has.
You know, but you don't mind doing something like that, which you have to show if there is a reason to do so. And I do think we might have to live with restrictions on international travel for a while until the rest of the world and the places where we want to go catch up with us in terms of vaccination. But if vaccination is a success, and if it means something, it means that a very large number of people cannot get ill with the virus, even if they ingest it in some way. They cannot get ill with the virus. So if you've been vaccinated, you really shouldn't need to worry too much, any more than you worry about getting the common cold or getting the flu from people. And that's what I mean by normalization. We need to normalize the virus as well as normalize our own lives. We need to treat it as being something that does happen and people will get, but in numbers that can be coped with and which can be part of a rolling and improved vaccination program, just as we do flu at the moment. And if I may say so, there's a lot of progress being made in that. We are running the biggest clinical trials in the world in this country, and we're discovering new drugs. Dexamethasone is old hat now, but there have been other anti-inflammatory drugs that show that they help if people get the virus and that they help with the treatment. This is a medical problem to be handled with medical solutions, but we've handed it all over, the running of it's been all handed over to a bunch of mathematical geeks who wouldn't know what they were doing medically. They're just running models, many of which have flawed assumptions in them.
Well, this is it. I mean, I keep hearing different figures from them as well, because first it was Chris Whitty saying 30,000 extra people could die in the summer. That seems to have gone down to 16,000. Nobody's explained why that's happened. Also, of course, many of these people that you describe are, in fact, behavioural scientists, which is basically, for me, shorthand for con men, because these are people who supposedly predict people's behaviour, and when they get it wrong, they don't seem to have any kind of answer for that.
There are too many behavioural scientists around, and I really don't think we need them at all. In fact, I'm coming to the point of view that SAGE is now so worried about some public inquiry. I think it's a great mistake, great danger to the country when last year, people were demanding, for political reasons, public inquiry and basically demanding heads, people hanging from nooses over the handling of this virus, which was unprecedented, which nobody could actually get right. There's no right answer even now to what was the right date to lock down and so on, when you take all the factors together. And so what it's done, I think, is it's made SAGE and much of that sort of world far too nervous. And I think we're coming to the point where actually we should just say SAGE isn't helping anymore. No. We're saying do without medical advice, but the government doesn't need SAGE to have medical advice. It can internalize the medical advice. It's got a chief medical officer after all. It doesn't need this bunch of people, these randoms wandering around from one television station to another, giving us contradictory opinions all the time.
Yeah.
And it does need to focus on normality, what that means, and getting back to it. Cautiously, I don't mind a bit of caution. I don't mind if we're a bit slower than we need to be, but we need to have the goal clearly in sight. It doesn't include vaccine passports or massive test and trace with people being told to isolate and no compensation.
Exactly right. And why is it as well that many of these SAGE individuals go on television when they do and radio when they do, and then claim to be speaking in, quotes, a personal capacity, in which case, why are they even on? I don't even know why people get them on. I mean, I wouldn't have one on my show talking absolute and utter cobblers, pretending that there's some kind of data that they're following when there clearly isn't, and it's all being made up in a lab somewhere. But also, it struck me yesterday, basically, that in the end, somebody was really pulling, as you say, in two different directions with Boris, because he couldn't seemingly confirm anything. He couldn't seemingly commit to anything. And I was very interested, and I know you've retweeted this piece from The Spectator this morning from Fraser Nelson about how he's talking about how carefully he said what was going to happen on Monday, but wouldn't really go beyond that. And then said that there would be no reason to provide certification of a COVID status report in a pub garden. He did not say inside a pub.
Yeah, well, look, it's right that the Prime Minister should listen to everybody before jumping to conclusions and making his mind up. And I think Boris will see us through this and bring us out on the other side. And I think that's where his instincts are. So I think we're at a stage at the moment, clearly from yesterday's interview, where Boris hasn't quite made his mind up what he's doing. And I think we need to keep the pressure up and ensure that he listens to all voices so that he comes down on the right side of this. Otherwise, if you live on facts, you can see a way forward. If you live on fears, which is what we're being told, oh, there might be a third wave, there might be a fourth wave, this might happen, that might happen. If you live on fears, you will never, ever get back to normal because you can never dispel or disprove the fears.
Right.
There's always going to be a reason down the road for not doing the right thing.
Well, this is the trouble. I mean, I heard somebody this morning talking about what could happen, if the virus came back in a stronger way, much stronger way than before. And you're kind of going, well, that's fine, but that's literally pie in the sky. There's no evidence for it. We appear to be in a very...
But you can mitigate it. I mean, personally, rather than have vaccine passports, if you're really worried about a third wave or a fourth wave overwhelming the NHS, I'd say, OK, reopen the Nightingale hospitals, employ a whole load of extra nurses and doctors, have them standing round doing nothing, so you're ready for it. And at least then you'd have externalized and made clear what the cost of mitigating these fears was. And you might say, well, it'd be extremely stupid to have a load of doctors standing round and nurses standing round doing nothing. But that's the whole point. The whole point of saying you have to run the country according to NHS capacity is that is not a sensible thing to do. It isn't a sensible thing to do. But I'd rather see that done than have everybody, living in this state of constant fear, and that is really implied by vaccine passports. The other thing is, I don't think people will use them.
Well, I don't think people will. I mean, it will be similar to what happened in the test and trace scenario back in the summer of last year, where certain restaurants and certain bars were very kind of deliberate and were very draconian about who they let in and what details they got.
Well, not one I found.
Well, most of the places I went to were not like that at all, because my friends who run restaurants and run bars said, look, it's not our business to find out who's here. If the government asks us to take a name, we take a name. It's nothing for us as to whether that name's real or whether the phone number's right. They're not the police. They're not going to do that, are they? Yeah,
but there's a small number of SAGE epidemiologists, you see, who have, for the whole of the last year, been pinning everything, not on vaccines, but on test and trace, because they thought they saw that working in South Korea and places like that, with totally different cultures operating in a different, also at a different stage in the pandemic. But test and trace only makes sense if it's accompanied by test, trace, and isolate. And they never actually have explained how it is in a free country like ours, you are going to get mass compliance with isolation unless you have coercive measures. So unless you actually have the police and it's no good PHE ringing you up and saying, "Are you at home, darling?"
Yes.
You know, I mean, that might or might not work. I was in, and if you don't answer the phone, I was in the bath, I was in the shower, whatever. Who knows? You know, to make it work, you have to have coercive measures, which they do have in places like Hong Kong and some Asian places. Measures which, if you explain them to the British people now, they'd say, "Well, we're not doing that. We're not putting up with all that." In Hong Kong, and I'm not criticizing them, this is their choice as to how to manage the pandemic. It's their country, it's not my country. In Hong Kong, you get a call, it could be in the middle of the night, they come round in a specially sanitized bus, they take you and your family off to a government-run hotel, and they keep you isolated for 10 days. And it can happen to anybody, and it can happen at no notice at all. Keep you isolated, I think it's 10 days, might be 2 weeks, because you're on a trace system which says you've been in proximity to something which they regard as a risk. And they've kept numbers very low, but that's the price you have to pay. That's the only way to make test, trace, and isolate work properly. And I hope in this country that's for the birds.
Well, I think it is, but also one of the criticisms of that system in this country as well is that many people were not compensated if they were supposed to be self-isolating, and therefore
that is true, of course, as well. You have no incentive to isolate other than public spiritedness, and at the same time, many people who were asked to isolate were being told that the jobs they were doing were essential jobs.
Yes, exactly right.
Essential workers. So what is it? Am I a essential worker? What am I doing? Am I meant to give up my wage?
But that's the point, you know.
Not just poor people, not just people on low wages.
So I guess the question, Lord Moylan, is how do we wrench Boris Johnson, the man that you knew when he was Mayor of London, to be a very sort of go-getty kind of, entrepreneurial style mayor, who made a lot of things work in London, who got a lot of things done, and who was re-elected, despite the fact that the large proportion of voters in London probably would not vote Conservative as a general rule. How do we get that guy back? Because he's gone somewhere.
Well, I don't think that's fair. I think we're getting back. There are two answers to that. The first is keep telling him, so that he hears the voices from people saying this isn't the answer. We've got to be braver and bolder about this, and we can afford to be brave and bold because of your success with the vaccination program, which has made us a world leader. So we need to build on that, and he will understand that message. The cynical answer to that, of course, is that actually an awful lot of this could come down to Keir Starmer. Because in the end, if the Labour Party decides to vote for whatever the government is proposing, when it comes to propose it, and we don't know what they're proposing in detail, and we don't know when they're going to propose it, but if it comes to a vote in the House of Commons and the Labour Party votes for it, then it will pass. And if the Labour Party doesn't vote for it, it is reasonable to think at the moment that it could fail. And Boris is perfectly aware of that. He can count. I mean, all politicians know how to count. And he can count, and he knows, that's part of it. So a lot of this is going to come down, a lot of this pressure is really on Keir Starmer. I personally think, speaking entirely personally, that Boris would be quite thrilled if Keir Starmer came out against it.
Yes, I think he probably would. The trouble is, Keir Starmer hasn't seen a fence he doesn't want to sit on. And I mean, every time he gets asked to make a decision about anything...
The Labour Party, I think his health secretary has been doing the rounds this morning, taking a rather firmer line than the leader did a couple of days ago. So maybe he's also moving in a certain direction.
Yes, well, that would be good. But when you see headlines like this, where we've apparently spent £2.8 billion for the UK's lateral flow COVID tests from a Chinese businessman based in California, who apparently originally is from Wuhan, you do wonder what on earth is going on. Why are we spending all this money on testing kits that are probably not going to work at all, and as we know already, are pretty unreliable?
Well, I don't know how reliable they are. It worries me, however. I'm not commenting on that. They may be the most perfect and perfectly functioning test kits, and if we need them, it doesn't really matter, in my view, where we get them from. But what does worry me is that there are certain institutions where testing is now becoming the norm in a way that I think is going to be very, very difficult to lift in the future. I worry about children in school being tested repeatedly. People who go into schools, adults who go into schools, are required to submit to tests as well. I mean, legitimately going into school, like school governors and people like that. And that worries me. And it would worry me deeply if employers started requiring that.
Yes. I'm told some already have started to do it, but it's a very slippery slope, as you say.
Yeah, it's a very slippery slope to a two-tier society in which so much information and data is kept about you by people who simply can't be trusted to keep it secure, and that includes the government, as we know, because no database is secure, however much they seek to make it so. There are people who are adept at getting into it.
Yeah.
And I think it's also mildly humiliating. It's, there has to be an adult life for adults, and that means a degree of independence and autonomy about what you do. And with vaccination, for the first time in a year, we start to know that we can do as individuals what we want to do without greatly endangering others. So the argument for limiting our individual freedoms, which was that we endanger others in doing so, and it's irresponsible and wrong, that argument falls away the more effective the vaccination program is, and the better the treatments become for people who develop COVID. So we need to hold that in mind. The whole mindset that we have to submit to these controls falls away as on the evidence when vaccination and better treatments become available.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And just finally, Lord Moylan, this vaccine passport that they speak of is, as Fraser Nelson has said, not simply a vaccine passport. It's effectively a bio-identity card. It's loaded with your personal health data, which they can put any number of things on.
Yeah, that's it, basically. It is your entire medical history. If they're using the NHS app. Of course, if they're inventing a new app, then it won't be ready until, for another couple of years, and it'll never work. So that's a bit more...
You sure it won't be world class like the last one?
It probably won't be world class, no. What we've done many world class things in this country over the COVID, with the vaccination. We are the world leaders in genomic sequencing, so we're the best at identifying mutant variants as they arise. And we've also run these massive trials, random trials that have produced validations of some drugs that help in treatment, and also proven that some other drugs that people hoped would work haven't worked. So in some areas, Britain, which has a fantastic medical science reputation and skills, in some ways Britain has led the world, but we're not the best at developing apps yet. Maybe.
No, we're certainly not.
Sector booms, but not yet.
No, quite. Lord Moylan, pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Very much common sense coming from Lord Moylan, Conservative peer, former partner with Boris Johnson, if you like, in the running of London when he was Mayor of London, when he was a very much different individual to the one we saw yesterday